Welcome to PBCJ's coverage of the sitting of the Senate. I'm Simone Absalom, and I'll provide a brief outline of what's expected to take place during the sitting. But before you begin, did you know if a member shows disregard for the authority of the chair or abuses the rules of the Senate by persistently and willfully obstructing or otherwise, the President shall direct the attention of the Senate to the incident and move that the Senator be suspended from the service of the Senate. And the President shall put the question, no seconder be required, no amendment, no adjournment, no debate being allowed. On the agenda for this sitting, the Terrorism Prevention Designated Reporting Entity Public Accountants Order 2017 resolution. Members will also discuss the Terrorism Prevention Designated Reporting Entity Gaming Machine Operators Order 2017 resolution. 3 bills are down for mention. A bill entitled An Act to Amend the Income Tax Act. A bill entitled An Act to Amend the Stamp Duty Act, and a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Transfer Tax Act. If you are planning to attend a session at Gordon House, here are some rules you need to keep in mind. No visitor shall create any act of disorder within the precincts of the House. No visitor shall be admitted to the House without first obtaining an admission card from the office of the clerk. Visitors who remain within the precincts of the House during a suspension of the session are asked to keep silent. No photography, videography, or sketching of the proceedings is allowed unless so authorized by the presiding officer. And there should be no smoking inside the parliamentary building. Now over to the proceedings.
Indeed, I am busher for the day. I don't want anyone to believe that there will be any permanency to where I sit, you know, because that may cause some discomfiture. But I don't know which side, perhaps down the middle. But it's for the day, and for the day, you know, I don't think there is anything controversial that will take place. Not that I would not have been happy if there had been something controversial, but there is nothing. We hope to work through the day in a very comfortable manner.
Thank you, Senator Knight. Just to indicate as well, in anticipation of our sitting next week, the Poet Laureate, Miss Lorna Goodison, will be paying an official visit to the Senate. So I asked my colleagues to try and make every effort to be early next week. We're actually starting at 11 o'clock, which is not good. And just before I move on, in the gallery is Michelle Ann Williams, who is an attorney at law from the Maryland State Bar, who is visiting us this morning. Welcome, Madam. Statements by ministers. Announcements.
Laid on the table of the Senate today are the following: Ministry Paper number 60, Cabinet Agenda Issues, dated August 14, 2017. Beg your pardon.
Laid on the table of the Senate today are the following: Ministry Paper number 60 of 2017, entitled Cabinet Agenda Issues, dated August 14, 2017. Ministry Paper number 61 of 2017, titled Cabinet Agenda Issues, dated August 29, 2017. Ministry Paper number 62 of 27, an annual report of the Office of the Utilities Regulation for the financial year 2016-2017. Ministry Paper number 63 of 2017, entitled Cabinet Agenda Issues, dated September 4, 2017. Ministry Paper number 64 of 2017, entitled Cabinet Agenda Issues, dated September 11, 2017. And the National Housing Trust Housing Benefit Special Selection Estuary Housing Development Order 2017.
Bills brought from the Honourable House of Representatives.
The following is a message from the Speaker of the House of Representatives to the Honourable Senate. I have the honour to advise the Honourable Senate that on the 10th day of October 2017, the House of Representatives agreed to the Senate amendments to the bill entitled An Act to Establish a Contributory Pension Scheme for the Public Service to be known as the Public Service Pension Scheme, from which payment of pensions, gratuities, and other allowances are to be made in respect of the service of pensionable officers and to provide for other related matters. I also have the honor to advise the Honourable Senate that on the 10th day of October 2017, the bill entitled An Act to Amend the Processed Food Act and the Processed Food General Regulations 1959 was passed in the House of Representatives.
Thank you, Madam Clerk.
Mr. President, I hereby signify my willingness to take charge of the bill.
Thank you, Leader.
A bill shortly entitled the Processed Food Amendment Act 2017 read a first time.
Mr. President, may I ask for second reading of the bill? Oh, may I give notice of second reading of the bill? Pardon me.
Petitions, papers, reports from committees, notices of motions given orally, questions and answers to questions.
Mr. President, if I may, I was given an assurance by Minister responsible for information that within 2 weeks, being today, I would have received answers to my question. I'm not sure if Leader of Government Business is aware. No, I know she's aware. I'm not sure if she has the answers to those questions.
My recollection, Mr. President, is that last week the Senator Reid indicated that he had them, but they were being fine-tuned. They were not. No, he did not say for today. No, he had said that we're working on them, and that. But in any event, he is not here to present them, and I do not have the final draft. So hopefully, when he returns, that matter can be addressed. Thank you.
President, I accept the position of the Leader of Government Business, but I do recall, and Hansard can bear us out, that not last week, but the week before, it was agreed that 2 weeks. It was agreed.
Thank you. Sorry, Senator Brown.
Yes, sir. The other papers, 2 questions that are from standing my name that are due for answer today. And like Senator Fraser Binns, I notice the minister is not here, but is the leader in a position to indicate us any knowledge as to the status of the answers? I raise this, President, because I am aware that you're insisting on the standing orders be followed in a number, if not all, issues. And the questions is one of those standing orders that has specific requirements.
Senator Brown, what I'm going to do, I suspect I know what the answer from the minister is going to be in the absence of Senator Reid. But what I will do, Senator Brown, what I'm going to do is to ask the clerk to write to Senator Reid and bring to his attention the fact that he has incurred my displeasure in not having the answers that you require. Madam Clerk, would you ensure that that is done, please?
Thank you, Mr. President.
Motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice. Motions relating to the sittings of the Senate. Motions for leave to introduce bills. The presentation of bills without leave of the Senate first obtained. Public business.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, at the last sitting of the Senate, I had indicated that we might be withdrawing two orders, orders numbered 1 and 2, represented on the order paper. But I want to indicate this morning that the intention is to proceed with the order and motion reflected at number 1 as is, but to take to withdraw the motion at number 2 and to take a new order and motion in its place. In this context, Mr. President, I wish to ask for your leave to withdraw the order and motion represented at number 2 on the order of business. I just wish to make clear, Mr. President, for the record, that the reason in this regard, and order number 1 is the order which is the order which allows for the designation of public accountants as reporting entities under the Terrorism Prevention Act. What was recognized, Mr. President, is that the amendments that were being considered would essentially create two parallel regulatory frameworks. And I suspect this could be the reason why former Senator Golding, who had recommended the amendments, had indicated that he wouldn't press the issue because he recognized that dissonance might be created. So the intention is going to be to approach the ministry formally about coordinating amendments between both the POCA Public Accountants Regulation and the Terrorism Prevention Act designation regulation. That way, when the changes are made, they are made at the same time and won't create any confusion among the persons who will be regulated thereby. The gaming designated reporting entity order, the gaming order which is reflected at number 2, that change is not policy-based. It is just a correction and therefore shouldn't create any dissonance, and that's why we'll go with the new order in that regard. In that context, Mr. President, and with your leave, might order represented at number 2 of the order paper be withdrawn?
The question is whether or not this is the wish of the Senate. Is this the wish of the Senate? Those in favor? Against? The motion is now withdrawn. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, might I ask for recommittal of announcements and notices of motion given orally?
The question is that the items listed at announcements and notices of motions be given orally be recommitted. Those in favor? Against? The ayes have it. Announcements.
Also laid on the table of the House today is the Terrorism Prevention Designated Reporting Entity, Gaming Machine Operators Order 2017 and Resolution.
Notices of motions given orally.
Mr. President, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the Senate, I will move the following motions. 1, the Terrorism Prevention Act. The Terrorism Prevention Designated Reporting Entity, Gaming Machine Operators Order, Resolution 2017. Whereas Section 15 of the Terrorism Prevention Act, hereinafter referred to as the Act, imposes reporting duties on certain specified entities, and whereas Section 15(2) of the Act provides that the Minister may designate any entity as an entity to which the provisions of Section 15 of the Act shall apply, and whereas Section 15(2) of the Act provides for the aforementioned designation to be made by order subject to affirmative resolution, and whereas on the 12th of October 2017, the Minister made the Terrorism Prevention Designated Reporting Entity Gaming Machine Operators Order 2017, now therefore be it resolved by this Honourable House as follows. This resolution may be cited as a Terrorism Prevention Designated Reporting Entity Gaming Machine Operators Order Resolution 2017. The Terrorism Prevention Designated Reporting Entity Gaming Machine Operators 2017, which was laid on the table of the Senate on this 13th day of October 2017, is hereby affirmed. Mr. President, in respect of the second motion, be it resolved that the National Housing Trust Housing Benefits Special Selection Estuary Housing Development Order 2017 under the National Housing Trust Act, which was laid on the table of the Senate on the 13th day of October 2017, be referred to the Regulations Committee of the Senate for consideration and report. Mr. President, I further beg to give notice that at a later stage today, I will move for the suspension of standing orders to enable me to take these motions. Mr. President, with your leave, I now move for the suspension of standing orders to enable me to take the motions, notice of which I gave earlier.
Thank you, Madam. Those in favor?
Mr. President,
Sorry.
just some clarification. In respect to the gaming machine operators, does this apply to every single bar with a one-arm, what do you call it? One-arm bandit or one-arm jackpot machine? Because they too, it would appear, are part of the gaming machine operators. And as I understand it, there are some places, some hotels with gaming rooms, and they operate as gaming operators. But the bar on Church Street or any other roads in poor communities.
You're seeking a clarification because there is a debate to be had. You want to keep that?
Well,
It's just a clarification you want.
if there's debate coming, I will wait until then.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so those in favor? Against? The ayes have it.
Mr. President, might I ask that the motion in respect of the National Housing Trust be approved?
Those in favor? Those in favor? Against? The ayes have it.
Mr. President, in respect of the matters under the Terrorism Prevention Act, the debate, as you would be aware, was largely conducted last week with the proviso that we would be revisiting the two orders which, of course, have been brought to attention of the Senate today. So what I would propose is, rather than once more engaging or myself opening a substantive debate in that regard, is that I would just ask the senator who has indicated that he has queries or points which he wishes to make in debate on this matter, that he proceed, and I will respond to them in closing.
Senator Brown?
I'm glad, Mr. President, that you recognize this senator is Senator Brown. I was having a little difficulty with the he-she issues. Yeah, Mr. President, the concern I have, while we support, as we did last week, the general direction, we want to know, and the citizens of Jamaica are entitled to know, who does this order applies to? Does it apply to hotel, big hotel, or medium hotel, or both big and medium hotel with gaming room? Is there a number of machines that must exist in a location to be so described as a gaming machine operator who must be reporting under this order? Because the consequence of failing to report under this order can be significant. So people need to know, does the little barman in Black River, or in Maypen, or in Flankers, operating one or two or three jackpot machine, does this apply to them? Because we need to be clear so that the People out there who must know what the law says and who must comply with it are themselves clear. And this is something that I'd ask Mr. President, because if they don't know, they're likely to be in breach, and we want to protect them.
Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Brown. Thank you.
Mr. President, I wish to thank Senator Brown, Senator Lambert Brown, for the heightened protective sentiments which he has expressed this morning. I share them. It's important that people understand laws and regulations in so much as it is possible for the assurance of compliance or better likelihood of compliance. Perhaps the matter could have been assisted by a proper reading of the actual order, because the order states at paragraph 3 that the designation applies to any person who operates 20 or more gaming machines pursuant to a license under the Betting, Gaming and Lotteries Act. So this is exactly what applies under the poker regime, because if senators will recall that the same scheme was used of designated reporting entities under the Proceeds of Crime Act. The same language has been used for the creation of these orders under the Terrorism Prevention Act. So again, for clarity, the entities which are expected to report under the TPA are the same as those which are expected to report under the POCA, and these are those operators who operate 20 or more gaming machines with a license so to do. Mr. President, again, I mean, it bears emphasizing, although I have just stated it, that this is not a new regime. Although it operates under the Terrorism Prevention Act and accordingly is relevant to lists and procedures that are established in relation to the UN Security Council committees that are established to identify terrorist organizations for the purposes of highlighting and identification of areas of risk within these the professions or areas of business which are identified by these designated orders. The regime in itself is one which persons should be used to under the POCA, because that was done several years ago, and accordingly is one which has some recency and some currency in terms of persons' understanding. In that context, Mr. President.
Mr. President, before you do that, before you make that, I just want to clarify on a point of order. Yeah. What I want to do is to seek a clarification of what I said.
Point of order or clarification?
A clarification on what the minister said relative to some reading would have been helpful. But this order which has been provided to me by Senator Fraser Binns was not on my desk this morning. And I looked at the original one, which did not have the thing about 20.
But you see it there now, though.
They provided to us earlier. The question would not have been asked.
Okay, thank you, Senator Brown. Leader, continue, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. It was not a lengthy sheet, and it was circulated on the handed out. But let's not descend into minutia. Paragraph 3 clearly sets out exactly the scope that's relevant for the purposes of the order, Mr. President, and I ask my colleagues if there are no further comments which they wish to offer in debate, if the orders could be approved. Thank you.
So the question is that the motion moved by Senator Kamina Johnson, Minister Kamina Johnson, be approved. Those in favor? Against? Ayes have it.
Mr. President, having now addressed the motions which were tabled today and therefore were the subject of my motion and further motion to suspend standing orders in order to have those taken, I wish to address the matter of the designated reporting entity public accountants order I don't anticipate that any further debate would be necessary, but this is the one which was on the paper from last week, and I wish to ensure for the record that this order is also taken and approved. I've just addressed the gaming and the NHT, both of which required suspension of standing orders for us to take them as they were tabled today. The public accountant order was, of course, properly before us from last week. I therefore wish to ask the Senate to approve this order. Thank you.
The question is that the motion moved by the Minister, Senator Johnson Smith, be approved. Those in favor? Against? Ayes have it.
Thank you, Mr. President. The remaining matter which it is proposed to take at public business today, Mr. President, concerns legislation. We have 3 companion bills before us, Mr. President: an act to amend the Transfer Act, an act to amend the Income Tax Act, and an act to amend the Stamp Duty Act in relation to tax exemptions for listed companies exercising share buyback options as per Section 58 of the Companies Act. Mr. President, the Senate is being asked to approve amendments to these 3 acts for the purpose of exempting listed companies exercising share buyback options under the Companies Act. Prior to 2004, Mr. President, Jamaican companies could not repurchase their own shares. The Companies Act underwent significant amendments in that year with the object of modernizing the legislative framework in keeping with international best practice and to facilitate a framework to meet the needs of private sector entities in establishing different types of corporate entities. Mr. President, among other matters, the 2004 amendments to the Companies Act introduced by way of Section 58 the opportunity for companies to repurchase and the option for them to repurchase their shares. The section allows a company the power to redeem, purchase, or otherwise acquire shares issued by the company so long as the company's articles provided for that transaction. The 2004 amendments, Mr. President, however, did not provide for the consequential amendments in the relevant pieces of tax legislation. As a result, very few companies avail themselves of this option. From a pure policy perspective, it has been understood for quite some time that the policy intent as espoused by the 2004 Companies Act amendments were clear, and that is essentially that share buybacks are positive things that encourage liquidity in the market, but that they should be not only permitted, but facilitated, encouraged. And the need to provide, therefore, for legislative synergy between the Companies Act and the relevant tax legislation is therefore long overdue. Mr. President, the Senate is asked to note that under the current circumstances, an ordinary shareholder engaging in a share buyback transaction is at a disadvantage as compared to a shareholder selling shares to a third party as a pure stock transaction. And this is due to the fact that the latter transaction will incur no taxes, no stamp duty, no transfer tax, etc., while the shareholder that engages in a share buyback option would be taxed as if a distribution were being made. So the transaction would be subject to income tax, transfer tax, and stamp duty. And this reform is intended to regularize that situation, to level the playing field, and also to, again, increase liquidity. Mr. President, in providing for the requisite changes, the Ministry of Finance, Tax Administration Jamaica, together with the Stock Exchange, did extensive consultations with the members of the accounting fraternity as well as the private sector. And based on these consultations, the government is convinced that there is a need to provide for this change, given that the repurchase of shares will provide for increased liquidity and marketability of listed shares, as alluded to earlier, a mechanism by which dissident shareholders who wish to be bought out can more easily be bought out, and of course, more broadly, the general and continued modernization efforts of the Jamaica Stock Exchange, which resulted in the local exchange being lauded in recent times by Bloomberg in 2015 as the #1 stock exchange We'll continue to build on these accomplishments, sir, by ensuring that local securities and the relevant market practice is in line with the more established jurisdictions. Mr. President, the Senate is also advised that given the protracted time that it has taken to address the discrepancy between the Companies Act and the relevant tax acts, companies have become anxious. The current financial dynamics and fast-changing pace of business require a regulatory regime that provides companies with the ability to act and/or react with viable financial solutions. The Senate is therefore being requested today to advance this long-awaited legislative reform. Mr. President, it should be noted that disadvantages related to share buybacks were considered, particularly as they relate to a company's ability to use this mechanism to manipulate share price. It has been clearly determined through discussions with the stock exchange and others that repurchase positions, buyback provisions, do not in and of themselves introduce this dynamic or increase the risk proportionately. The issue of manipulation and how to treat with it in the best interest of shareholders and the general public is always at the forefront and therefore always covered under the stock exchange rules. Again, we're speaking about transactions that occur within listed companies and accordingly are managed or are governed by the rules of the Jamaica Stock Exchange. And in this particular issue, they are treated under the rules relating to takeovers and mergers, 1999, and Appendix 1 of the Stock Exchange Rulebook. Mr. President, as alluded to earlier, robust discussions were held with the Stock Exchange and they're in agreement with these amendments. In fact, the Stock Exchange has advised the government that with the legislative reforms, there will also be a review of the current rules to ensure synergy with Government of Jamaica's reformed outlook, ensuring that also the ordinary shareholder is appropriately considered in these matters. Again, the amendments today, as they will largely be applicable to listed companies, will take place in the context of the Companies Act, the Stock Exchange rules, and the regulations and guidelines of the Financial Services Commission, which are also relevant to listed companies, Mr. President. I will now look briefly at the clauses of the bills, Mr. President. The Income Tax Act, the amendment to the Income Tax Act, principally takes place through an amendment of Section 34 of the Principal Act, which is amended under the heading Distributions to Shareholders. Mr. President, 34.1 is amended by deleting the full stop at the end of subparagraph B and substituting therefore a semicolon and inserting next after paragraph B a new subparagraph C, which states that so much of the dividend as is provided by the body corporate to have been used to redeem, purchase, or otherwise acquire shares issued by the body corporate, if 1, the shares are listed on a recognized stock exchange, and 2, the shares are redeemed, purchased, or otherwise acquired pursuant to the rules of the recognized stock exchange on which the shares are listed, and where applicable, in accordance with any terms and conditions upon which the shares were issued by the body corporate. Mr. President, in respect of the amendment to the Transfer Tax Act, the amendment takes place firstly through Section 17.1 of the Principal Act, which inserts a new paragraph G, which includes or refers to any transfer of shares where a company redeems, purchases, or otherwise acquires shares issued by it, if 1, the shares are listed on the Jamaica Stock Exchange or any other stock exchange signified by order of the Minister to be recognized for the purposes of this paragraph, and 2, the shares are redeemed, purchased, or otherwise acquired pursuant to the rules of the stock exchange on which the shares are listed as required under subparagraph 1, and where applicable, in accordance with any terms and conditions upon which the shares were issued by the company. Mr. President, in respect of paragraphs, or rather sections 19(2)A and 19(A)(1) of the Principal Act, which are being amended hereby, Mr. President, the dates, the 22nd day of April 1994, will be removed and replaced with the words, the date of commencement of the Transfer Tax Amendment Act 2017, of course, clarifying the effective date of operation of these new provisions. Mr. President, in respect of the amendment of Section 33 of the Principal Act, Section 33(2)A of the Principal Act is again amended by deleting the words the 22nd day of April 1994 and substituting, therefore, the date of commencement of the Transfer Tax Amendment Act 2017 and deleting the numerals subsection 1E and substituting, therefore, the words and numerals subsections 1E and G. This is a similar amendment which is made to 19(2)A and 19(A)(1 as well, Mr. President. Mr. President, the first schedule is also amended in that paragraph 3.2 of part 1 of the first schedule is amended by deleting the word or at the end of subparagraphs A and B, deleting the full stop at the end of subparagraph C and substituting therefore a semicolon and the word or, inserting next after the subparagraph C the following as subparagraph D. D relates to the redemption, purchase, or other acquisition of the shares of a company by the company which issued the shares if 1, the shares are listed on the Jamaica Stock Exchange or any other stock exchange signified by the order of the minister to be recognized for the purposes of Section 17(1)G, and 2, the shares are redeemed, purchased, or otherwise acquired pursuant to the rules of the stock exchange on which the shares are listed as required under subparagraph 1, and where applicable in accordance with any terms and conditions upon which the shares were issued by the company. Mr. President, in respect of the amendment to the Stamp Duty Act, the amendment will be to the schedule of the Principal Act, and the schedule is amended under the heading Exemption from any stamp duty under the preceding head Shares. By inserting next after the paragraph relating to transfer of securities, Mr. President, the following: the redemption, purchase, or other acquisition of the shares of a company by the company which issued the shares if 1, the shares are listed on the Jamaica Stock Exchange or any other stock exchange signified by order of the minister to be recognized for the purposes of this exemption, and 2, the shares are redeemed, purchased, or otherwise acquired pursuant to the rules of the stock exchange on which the shares are listed as required under paragraph 1, and where applicable, in accordance with any terms and conditions upon which the shares were issued by the company. Mr. President, these matters are not controversial in the context introduced by the acting leader of opposition business in the Senate today. They are long awaited. They are long awaited by the private sector or by listed companies who do wish the facilitation to be afforded by these provisions and the liquidity which it will introduce into the market, which of course stimulates economic activity. So, Mr. President, I look forward to hearing the contributions of colleagues on both sides on this matter, and with that, retake my seat. Thank you.
Mr. President, I thought I was saying to, I think we will share it, right, Minister? We'll have no problem sharing it. Thank you so much, Mr. President. And I stand to make my very brief contribution to these companion bills. Let me say that we on this side are in full agreement, Minister, and you will not have any opposition from us in that regard. Mr. President.
Doesn't mean no contradiction. Opposition.
The opposition, you have our full support. You have our full support. The fact, Mr. President, is that the matter before us is not contentious at all. And we believe that it is something, Jamaica has been doing very well in terms of the ease of doing business. And for us, this is just another step in that process, and we are in full support of that. And Senator Webley is here, Senator Golden isn't, but those who are involved in the corporate world know that buy and back share is something that really is part of the general operation of companies. And this is done for several reasons. Some ministers spoke about liquidity, but also because, it also helps you in the balancing of ownership. It also could be, and I note the minister said that in our consultation, one of the concerns was dealt with in terms of manipulating shares, because one of the things you find is that companies may buy back shares when in their mind, shares are undervalued, and they believe that buying back shares, they can consolidate and then re-enter the market. And so I'm very happy that that concern has been raised, and there's been a commitment of sort where they'll operate within the rules of the stock market. But the fact remains is that this is something that is encouraged, it's something that we want to see in Jamaica. But we are asking, Minister, that as we undertake this, because it is a tax incentive, that there be some, and I'm choosing my words correctly because I don't want to say the process must be managed, but it has to be balanced. Because when you look, for example, a study that was done looking at the share buyback in the United States shows that 4% of their GDP is actually spent on share buyback. And within the last 10 years, over 54% of the profits of companies that are listed on S&P 500 have been spent in shares buyback. But this has not really filtered down to the workers. The economy remains, limited growth. And so for a country like Jamaica, where we're trying to grow the economy, we're trying to encourage small business, we're trying to increase wages, then we have to ensure that when this is done, that the benefits not only accrue to the company, but that it is filtered down to not just the shareholders, but also to workers. Because I believe that this will help us in creating the kind of Jamaica that works for everyone. This will help us in terms of increasing income. It will help us as well in terms of creating that kind of economy. And so we're going to ask that as we move forward, that there be some consideration in that regard. The other thing I wondered, Minister, again, I'm very happy that you consulted, but I wondered whether the government has any idea as to the cost implication with the tax incentive now. Do we have an idea as to how much it will cost the government or how much the government will lose from this tax benefit that will now accrue to the companies? Mr. President, as I said before, from our standpoint, it is something that we support. We believe that it is one of the things that was needed to give full effect to Section 58 of the Companies Act, and we stand in full support of that, if it pleases you.
Thank you very much, Senator Fraser-Binns. Senator Webby.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I'm happy to hear that there is consensus on both sides in terms of the share buyback. And this is something, Mr. President, that as a private sector leader and as a PSOJ member, we have been trying to get this done from over a decade ago. So I'm happy to hear that there is consensus on both sides. Senator Fraser-Binns, and this is a question that was asked by all in our deliberations with the government, because it started from actually our Finance Minister, Omar Davis, in 2007, right up. What is the loss of revenue to the government? And in fact, it is actually zero. I'll tell you why, because no publicly listed company is going to do a share buyback without a tax waiver or this exemption being included in there, and that has been proven. So, Mr. President, I rise in support of the three bills before the House today: the Income Tax Amendment Act, the Stamp Duty Amendment Act, and the Transfer Tax Amendment Act. As you heard from both speakers, Mr. President, the bills will allow for the exemption of stamp duty, income, and transfer tax on share buyback transactions involving listed company. Again, Senator Brown, that is an important distinction, because what this is saying is that private companies cannot benefit from this change in the legislation. And I agree, Mr. President, with both speakers that this will certainly stimulate growth in the equity market in Jamaica, and I welcome the passage of these bills. Mr. President, a share purchase agreement, as you have heard and has been written, is a mechanism that is commonly used by companies in the first world countries. And I was very impressed by the statistics quoted by my Senator Fraser-Binns, and I'll expand on that according to a popular finance site, in 2016, U.S. companies stock buybacks total $536.4 billion. So the point is, Mr. President, share buybacks are done frequently by companies in well-developed countries, which has positive effects on a country's stock exchange. Share buybacks, as I mentioned earlier, in Jamaica are virtually non-existent because of this tax implications. And as a result, there have been really missed opportunities for public companies which would have wanted to pursue a share repurchase program. The share buyback regime was part of a raft of amendments to the Companies Act in 2004. Sweeping changes were made to the legislation to modernize the way business is conducted in Jamaica. And I think it's also important to note, President, that other Caribbean countries removed the tax anomaly in their laws at the time they revised their company laws. So we are basically just catching up in terms of this amendment. Notwithstanding, Mr. President, we have come a far way with the change in the Companies Act, in our Companies Act. Our Companies Act must be reviewed continuously in this changing business environment to ensure that it is kept up to date. Mr. President, I'd like to use the example of Amazon and how the world of business has changed significantly. In 1994, Amazon sold its first book. In 1994, Amazon sold its first book. Since then, it has become the 10th largest online retailer in the world and is among the top 5 companies on the U.S. stock exchange. So, Mr. President, in terms of facilitating business, in the new world of doing business, it is extremely important as a country that we continuously review our Companies Act. I gave an example of Amazon in 1994 selling its first book, and is now one of the largest companies in the world. The question that we need to ask ourselves as legislators, how are we facilitating the innovators of this new world in business by our Companies Act? So, Mr. President, I think it's in going forward on how we do business, we will need to grow the level of competitiveness as a country. We need to ensure that we remove all impediments to growth. We need to roll in the red tape, Mr. President, and roll out the red carpet as a country. Mr. President, as was stated earlier, my understanding from the debate on the bills in the lower house is that relevant stakeholders, such as the Jamaica Stock Exchange, the accounting profession, and the private sector were consulted, and they are supportive of these bills. I want to take this opportunity to congratulate our current Minister of Finance, Minister Ollie Shaw, for this consultative approach with the private sector, and I think it has gone on very well. It went very well. Mr. President, the consultation can be a series of meetings, formal meetings. Yeah, well, he wasn't Roman, I can assure you. Mr. President, my experience is that the capital markets in Jamaica and the Caribbean are relatively thin, and I have a bit of experience in there. That is that there's not a lot of trading of inequity compared to that of developed markets. Because of the low liquidity in a stock market, a company's shares are sometimes undervalued. A share purchase would send a signal to the market that a company views its shares as not properly valued, which gives confidence to the overall market. The greater benefit, however, is that the flexibility to increase shareholders' value. Companies are able to provide periodic cash returns to their shareholders, and in doing so, manage their excess cash. Mr. President, and it was raised by Senator Fraser-Binns and by the leader, while I support the share purchase mechanism for listed companies, I am mindful that certain controls are necessary to ensure that it is done in a responsible manner and the interests of shareholders are protected. The Jamaica Stock Exchange rules and the Companies Act have requirements that must be met for a company to purchase its own shares. Under the rules of the Stock Exchange, the controls include, amongst other things, giving 21 days notice of the intention to repurchase the stock, stating the purpose of the share acquisition and the source of funding of the transaction. Under the Companies Act, a declaration regarding the company's ability to pay its liabilities after the stock repurchase must be lodged with the Register of Companies, accompanied by the following: the company's last audited financial made up to no more than 12 months before the date of the statutory declaration, and the company's unaudited accounts up to no more than 45 days before the date of the statutory declaration, and any other relevant factors of which shareholders should be made aware. I fully, Mr. President, support the need for controls which ensure that the share buyback is not detrimental to the company, its shareholders, and by extension, the economy. Mr. President, I'm suggesting that there are other controls that should be considered for implementation. A share buyback should be subject to the approval of the shareholders by way of a special resolution. The declaration that is made under the Companies Act should also be accompanied by the company's liquidity and solvency ratios. Mr. President, there's another item that I'd just like to speak about very briefly, and it's my last point for today. As you heard me earlier, Mr. President, where I stated that the Jamaica Stock Exchange is thin, and there's a disadvantage of having a thin market. Shares are undervalued in a thin market. It is my view, and I've held it for a very long time, and I believe it's worth raising today in this Honourable House. It is time for us, Mr. President, to seriously debate having a regional stock exchange. And I don't mean a piecemeal exchange, I mean a regional stock exchange. Given the size of our exchange and the others in the Caribbean, our capital markets will be more efficient if we pool the 4 exchanges into one, if we merge the 4 exchanges into one. Our strength in numbers would mean more opportunities for investments, improved liquidity, and improved capital financing. The stock exchange rules in the Caribbean also need to be harmonized, as there are currently too many anomalies across countries in the Caribbean. A regional stock exchange, Mr. President, in my opinion, would be a win-win for all. And I'd like for us to seriously consider how we can make this happen. Mr. President, as I take my seat, I reiterate again, I'm happy this has been discussed by the private sector for over 10 years. My support for these bills, and I ask that we exercise vigilance to ensure that our Companies Act is kept up to date and in line with the most current best practices for our businesses. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Webby. Senator Morris.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I rise to make a brief intervention where this piece of these legislation are concerned, and I support the view from Senator Sophia Fraser-Vins that we fully support these legislation because we really are supportive of progressive development of our country. And Mr. President, the Minister spoke to the fact that this bill seeks to correct an anomaly that exists between individuals getting certain exemption in terms of income tax and transfers, tax and so forth, versus companies. And it speaks to, in a fundamental way, Mr. President, the incentivization of companies to invest in our country and to help grow the economy. But, Mr. President, I am forced to make my intervention from a social perspective because I believe that the time has fully come for us to use incentives that are given to companies to help drive social policy formulation and development. And I say so, Mr. President, because we have to start linking incentive granted to companies to the employment of vulnerable groups within our country, for example. And I make reference to this, Mr. President, because yesterday, myself and Minister Wheatley were involved in an event where we handed out some laptops to persons with disabilities. But it was brought home forcibly, Mr. President, where 4 persons with disabilities graduated from the university this year with first-class honors. And they have been having difficulties in terms of finding gainful employment, and they now join a long line of persons with disabilities who are unemployed. In fact, Minister, you would have been privy to an email that I shared with you with that young lady, very brilliant young lady who is at the Golden Age home. She has the skills, she has the talent that she can be gainfully employed. But the way how our society is configured, it forces persons with disabilities to be treated in a welfare mode. And I believe that there is a way that we can use these incentives that we are providing for companies to drive the social policy agenda to integrate persons with disabilities in the labor market. You know, and again, if he wasn't here, I would have said it, because Senator Webby's company is a classical example. I know of an individual with a disability that is working with a company. That person, in fact, developed the disability whilst he was there working with the company. And the company worked with the individual, sent the person to the Jamaica Society for the Blind, because I am privileged to have been the person they assigned as a mentor for him when he came to the Jamaica Society for the Blind. And that individual stayed with the company, allowed him to stay and to grow and to develop to the point where the person himself completed a PhD this year as well. And I believe that a company like Grace Kennedy should be rewarded for their effort, right? And likewise, other companies, there might be other companies out there who are engaged in such practice, and we have to encourage them in order to change the situation as it relates to the employment of persons with disabilities. We did a study. I was fortunate to have conducted it on behalf of the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, a socio-economic study on persons with disabilities, and the data showed that approximately 91% of the respondents being unemployed. Significant. And I believe that we have to put in place policy measures to ensure that these individuals are integrated in the labor market. And one way of doing so, Mr. President, Minister, is through the formulation of policies that will link tax incentives to the employment of vulnerable groups, such as persons with disabilities. It's a matter that I am prepared to discuss with the government to ensure that that policy is developed, because it is a policy initiative. I don't expect that, you know, we are going to amend the legislation here because it's a money bill, but through policy formulation, we can see some significant benefits there and make sure that when we exempt individuals from paying income tax, the other groups within the society benefit from those exemptions. May it please you, Mr. President.
Just before you, Senator Gill, Senator Morris, you know, I hear you complimenting the attitude of Grace Kennedy towards persons with disabilities in the society. And I listen carefully to what you say. However, it is my view that it is the government that should take the lead in this matter. Our parliament still is inaccessible to persons in a wheelchair, notwithstanding the legislation. I was recently in a South American country where the vast, well, I shouldn't say the vast majority, a significant number of the persons who work at the airport are persons with physical disabilities in various capacities. And I think that the government really, somebody like the airport's authority really needs to look at the possibility of employing persons with physical disabilities to work in their facility rather than having someone sitting in a chair, able-bodied person sitting in a chair. Use persons who are, by virtue of their disability, in a position to carry out that sort of function. It is a government neglect over the years. And the clerk is telling me that I shouldn't be commenting, but I use my privilege. Senator Gale. Senator Gale, I'm not drawing you back into it. Senator Gale. Thank you, Senator Morris.
Mr. President, can I, since you have that awesome privilege, sir, can I ask you kindly if I can speak from a seat just next to mine?
Yes, you can.
Mr. President, I welcome any attempt that is being made to modernize our methods of doing business, especially as it relates to investments and the stock exchange. And today, we are seeking to amend 3 bills: Stamp Duty Act, the Transfer Tax Act, and the Income Tax Act. And it's a money bill, so we can't do any changes. But, sir, removing share buyback measures from under the constraints that now exist, it's a widely accepted practice in many countries. And I believe that we all welcome the idea of companies on the Jamaica Stock Exchange having the option to repurchase their share tax-free. These bills, sir, were passed in the House of Representatives on July 25th. And although I'm surprised that they took some time to get here, they are finally before us, and I'm in total support of their objectives. One of the points raised during the debate on the bill in the House of Representatives in July was that while an ordinary shareholder is able to sell his or her shares to third party tax-free, if that shareholder were to sell those same shares to his or her own company, the individual would be subject to income tax. I know the opposition likes to suggest that it's a waiver, but it's not, because these companies don't have to go to the Minister of Finance to seek a waiver. It is simply a change in the way that we handle these buybacks, how the system operates, and how it allows any company listed on Jamaica Stock Exchange to make these kinds of decisions after reviewing their capital structure and determining their own rules and those of the stock exchange and how to proceed. So, Mr. President, in our way, it's our way of improving the environment in which we do business in Jamaica, and that is moving in the right direction. The current rules, sir, limit the Minister of Finance in terms of his power to grant waivers, but this move will remove the constraints on shares buyback. It also allows for the widest possible participation in ownership. Mr. President, shares buyback is not a popular practice in Jamaica, but I guess one of the turn-off was the fact that in the past, it had to be done by the minister granting a waiver, a very time-consuming activity. But I think that we owe it to our colleagues at Grace Kennedy, who saw the need to raise the issue for bringing back this to national attention. I'm sending credit to my colleague. So discussions were held with the International Monetary Fund on how we could handle it in our own economic environment. And there was agreement on making it a structural benchmark under the current agreement with the fund, under which the opposition fully supported the provisions in the lower house. In providing this policy change, Mr. President, it should be clear that the government did what was necessary to protect the best interest of the Jamaican people, especially those who we see investing as a newer means of achieving upward mobility and escaping the stranglehold of poverty. Currently, sir, the Jamaica Stock Exchange rules limit the proportion of a company-owned shares that may be repurchased, and the companies who break the rules are threatened with delisting. Now we are in a position to put these old rules behind us and join those prosperous countries who introduced these changes as part of the process of reform and pursuit of prosperity. Mr. President, we welcome the fact that it will be regulated by the FSC, which has been doing a fine job of monitoring the financial services sector, and no doubt will continue to do so under the new dispensation. And we expect, sir, to see more activity in the markets arising from these changes. So I want to congratulate the government on this very bold move. However, Mr. President, whilst I have the opportunity, I want to use and urge the government to take a closer look on the use of transfer tax and stamp duty. And another angle, and the effect it has been on other efforts, including real estate transactions. Take the National Housing Trust. Mr. President, we need to address the traffic jam affecting the National Housing Trust mortgages, because all NHT mortgages must be registered by the trust. The legal practitioners have often complained of experiencing unnecessary delays as a result of this mandatory process, and I believe it's time that mortgagors be allowed to have a different feeling, a different sense in how the process of transfer tax and stamp duty takes place. If we are going to reduce the time it takes to complete these transactions, we have to remove the congestion in the house of the stamp commissioner, where the transactions in some aspects, in some cases, are held up for weeks, for the commissioner to decide whether the value is acceptable in order to impose his own assessed value. As you are aware, sir, the trust is a statutory body incorporated under the National Housing Trust Act, which part of its functions develop housing scheme for sale to its contributors. Part and parcel of this function is the acquisition, subdivision of sale of land under the Transfer Tax Act and Stamp Duty Act. The Minister of Housing, sir, does not pay transfer tax or stamp duty when land is being sold. But the NHT, although it's a government agency, it has to do so. As a government agency, sir, charged with increasing the housing stock in Jamaica and providing housing solution for its contributors, I'm suggesting that a review of the Stamp Duty Act must be undertaken and the following considerations given. I believe, sir, that the NHT should be exempted from stamp duty when it's selling land similar to those exemptions granted by the Ministry of Housing. I also believe, sir, where Cabinet may have directed that the NHT take over developments. And I'll give you an example. The Memorandum of Understanding with SCJ Holdings for those cane lands. The NHT should be exempted from transfer tax and stamp duty, or at the very least, the sums payable should be assessed on the value of the land at the date of the purchasers acquired the same, and not at the current market value. Mr. President, the NHT is also called upon to provide social housing, supporting inner city communities. And in making that provision, this is one of the areas to where exemptions can be granted. But the real estate developers, the realtors, and the legal fraternity, they also complain about the time it takes to complete transactions. Complete the transactions of the transfer tax and stamp duties. And if we are to be a society that is effective and efficient, we have to seek ways to remove that burden in terms of the delay and the congestion of these transactions. These delays are also cost the country in the sense of it takes longer for the government to draw down and collect the duties arising from such transactions. So, sir, the delays being experienced points at times where it becomes frustrating to the players involved, the real estate agents, those seeking to acquire land or purchasing homes, the legal fraternity. So maybe that office need to actively look at the way it does things and improve its efficiency so that the stakeholders who utilize its services can feel a more effective and efficient outcome. So, Mr. President, I want to support the memorandum of objects of these three pieces of legislation, but outside of just doing these minor amendments, which will achieve great things, we also look at how we can remove the level of bureaucracies and create more efficiencies in critical areas and agencies that support the state. I thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
I suspect I can almost guarantee that Senator Gale, Senator Brown.
Yes, sir. Mr. President, I was tempted this morning to pull a joke, but I leave comedy to some other people. I was going to ask if since there are three bills, whether I have 3 times 30, but that was meant to be a joke.
All right, let me, Senator Brown.
Senator
Brown, let me just make myself very clear. If you can talk for 1.5 hours on these 3 bills, go ahead.
President, I did say I left joking to others, you know. So I didn't mean it to be so. But what I will do, however, Mr. President, is pick up from the point that my sister, Senator Fraser Binns, asks, is what is the impact on the budget of giving up this possible source of income? Stamp duty run about $12 billion per year now. Any of that we give up has to come back from somewhere else. And I'm not opposing the bills. The opposition is not opposing the bills. But we must have a dialogue. Because when we give up on the one hand, Senator Gale rightly pointed out, the IMF is going to ask you where you're going to get it back from on the other hand. And that's something that this debate thus far have not really addressed. Who is going to pay for this? I have no problem if when we give it up, it will stimulate business, it will increase jobs, it will do the social intervention that Senator Floyd Morris raised. But we must ask ourselves, who is going to be paying for what is given up? Because sadly, Mr. President, sadly, it is the poor and the middle classes in our country who are to be paying for these give back, or so-called give backs. I raise this because...
Mr. Okay.
Well, let me say it again so you may get up. When you talk about give back of taxes, it is the poor and the middle classes in the main who have to fill the gap. And I make no apology for saying so. So who want to get up can get up. But somebody must pay when it is given up.
Mr. President, perhaps.
Mr. President, on a point of order, Senator Brown could...
Point of order.
Senator Brown, I think, could be going on a road of misleading the House, Senator Brown. As Senator Fraser raised the same point, and I made the point that in terms of what we are discussing here today, there's no company that would do a buyback because of the tax implication unless the minister grants a waiver. And this is what we're trying to normalize. So it's not giving up because 0 times 0 is 0.
All right, thank you very much. That was by way of a clarification, not really a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I repeat the point. Anytime we give up, or we waive, or we seek a law that says there'll be no stamp duty paid, somebody has to fill that gap. And it is usually the poor and the middle classes of our country. Mr. President, let me continue, especially since it's not a point of order. I look at the government, central government operations numbers for August, which is the last available data from the Ministry of Finance. And while tax revenue is running at $11 billion ahead of budget, the question has to be asked, who is paying that? And when you examine it, Mr. President, $5 billion of that comes from the SCT, Special Consumption Tax. That's the white rum. And the man who begged me in St. Mary yesterday a drink, white rum and boom, call it, he has to pay that tax.
No, you did.
I did, Senator, correct. So, the white rum is one thing that affects poor people too. The gasoline is $14 per litre since March, more on taxes. So who is paying all of this tax for which you say there's no need to give back? It is the motorists. It is the consumers who are paying more because gas price took the price of bread up. Gas price took the price of chicken back up. Gas price took the price of bully beef up because transportation is taken into account. So let us be clear. While some are comfortable in getting relief, the poor and the middle class are feeling the burden of the new tax measures. $14 more per litre of gas. And when we told the government that that was going to be inflationary, we were told, no. But Mr. President, I pleaded the recent comments by the Honourable Minister of Finance that the gasoline dealers are causing inflation in the country. I don't think he was joking. He was making a serious accusation about them. But as Minister of Finance, when he admits that there's an inflationary impact, I must take that seriously. And that is found in the $14 more per litre of gas announced by the minister since March of last year. Inflation is the wickedest tax on the poor. We all agree on that. But the policies of this government, far from leading to prosperity, is leading to greater sufferation of the people out there. And so, I note, Mr. President, that this is not just the one policy to ease tax on the companies, which we support. I note from the data provided by the Ministry of Finance that there's no tax on the bauxite alumina sector. Not a single cent is being paid by them since April to August of this year. Not a single cent is being paid in the bauxite sector. So, when you look at the bauxite levy, the data from the Ministry of Finance shows that that is below budget. So who is paying the taxes in the country? Not those who are buying back stocks, not those in the wealthy bauxite companies. It is those taximan, the bike rider, who must buy gas at $14 more per liter since March. So when we come to this Senate to look at legislation, I have to ask myself, since everybody wants to speak for the companies, who speak for the people, who speak for the poor, who speak for the little shopkeeper, who speak for the farmer, who speak for the peanut vendor and the cane vendor and the coconut man and the workers in the factories. If I remember them, I was wondering in your speech, what about them? And so I feel it necessary, if I must stand alone, to speak up for the poor, because they are suffering too much at this time. Mr. President, I am on record of all sin in this Senate when I sat on that side as I sit now on this side. What about the education tax? Why is there no relief for the minimum wage worker who must pay education tax now? But there's a relief for those who want to make more by buying back their shares and improving the value of their companies. What about the minimum wage worker? Why should she or he be paying education tax on the first dollar? Why don't we move to remove education tax from all those earning below the income tax threshold? I make such a recommendation, again, Mr. President, that those workers below the income tax threshold should not be required to be paying education tax. If we can do it for the big companies listed on the stock exchange, why can't we do it for the small man? You see, Mr. President, when I look at the budget numbers, which is why the question, how will the budget be impacted by these bills, is so relevant. I find that the government is currently spending less money than their budget to spend between April and August. Expenditure is down $6.8 billion. And I have to ask, who are the people not benefiting from this government expenditure? Senator Skeffrey, I beg to disagree with you. Correct. Dr. Winston Green agitated for repairs to the Junction Road. Yes, I am a witness. You never for the NHT, but you don't want the Junction Road to be mentioned. Mr. President, let me be clear. If it is in the budget that we approved in the Senate for the Junction Road to be fixed, I ask myself, does this under expenditure meant that while money was there, the request, the agitation of Dr. Winston Green for that road to be fixed wasn't met? And Mr. President, I've heard press conferences being held.
Senator Brown, you're going to go back to the legislation. Come
but that's where I'm coming. I'm talking about money we're giving up in the budget. Money we're giving up in the budget. Money we're giving up in the budget. So, Mr. President, with your permission, I'd like to continue, sir. Mr. President, we're giving up money. We are giving... Mr. President, we are foregoing possible revenue. That is why we have brought these 3 bills to the House. Mr. President, in this under-expenditure, I am now being told, we have been told that road, the junction road is going to be fixed. I went on that road yesterday, Mr. President, and I see no sign of it being repaired. No signs of it being fixed. And even Senator Morris confirmed that he saw no such sign. Mr. President,
Senator Brown,
let us be
stick
clear.
to the legislation,
no, Mr.
please.
President, let us be clear. I must be concerned when we bring legislation here to forego potential revenue. What is the impact on the people? When I'm told that no powers can stop the road from being fixed, I have to ask myself, why hasn't it been fixed yet? Is this a PR game to tell people that something is going to be done when
Senator
nothing is being done?
Senator Brown, deal with the legislation.
Mr. President.
Senator Knight, you want to address me?
Mr. President.
You want to address me? Yeah, go ahead.
I think sometimes
you feel free to congratulate me.
I think sometimes
I have a right to
when senators are making their presentations on a particular bill, there is some misunderstanding here. One need not simply deal with the letter of the bill. One is allowed to deal with the implications that flow from the particular legislation that is being debated. And in this situation, what Senator Lambert Brown is doing is dealing with that which flows from the consequences of this bill. Now, there may be disagreement with him about what the consequences are, but the disagreement about what the consequences are is not a basis for suppressing him.
Senator Knight, I am not seeking to suppress Senator Brown. And I agree with you, in the debate on a particular bill, one is not really restricted to the 4 corners of the bill. But there is an overriding rule that says that it ought to be relevant. And what I'm saying is that I've given Senator Brown, I give latitude to everyone. And I just gave him a quiet warning, stick to the legislation, but now he's going a bit too far. But I'm going to allow him to continue and ask Senator Brown, just try and ease off of the, no, let me not put it that way. Just try and deal with the legislation at hand, please.
May I continue, Mr. President?
Of course.
It's sad that when people talk about matters affecting poor people, it's called politics. It's sad. But I'm not going to be restrained from talking about what the bill says.
I'm not going to allow you to say that because that is thrown at me.
It's not thrown at you, it's thrown generally. If you want to put yourself in it, Mr. President, and I hope you would not, but the reality is, some of the response I'm getting is when you talk about the companies that soak here, or you talk about the small people, the poor people, then that's politics. And I reject that.
That's certainly not my attitude. What I'm saying is deal with the legislation at hand and make your contribution relevant. That's all.
Mr. President, Too often bills come here.
Don't get sidetracked, man. Just go on.
I am dealing with the legislation.
Okay, go ahead.
Too often bills come here, and the members are not even aware of the consequences of these bills and the policies behind them. When we ask, for example, what's the impact on the budget? You think we're going to get that? When we ask about these issues, we don't get them. And I have every right to pursue. Mr. President, let us be clear. I would like to see and to vote today for a reduction in education tax. Not just for what Senator Webby wants, but for what the workers of Jamaica want. That's what I want. It's not one or the other, you know. It's not one or the other. It is both. You get your company relief, but the workers need to get some relief as well. Mr. President, I come here not with thin skin. I come here with 40-odd years of defending workers. 40-odd years of defending workers. And nothing will change that. Mr. President, it's not I alone who have been speaking about the impact of tax give back on the society. Minister of National Security, Bobby Montague, was quoted in the Gleaner saying the following. So if you do the maths, it gives you an idea of the cost of crime in Jamaica and how it affects you. Because as much as the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance gave back to our public servants 1.5 million tax-free, that money is being sucked, his word, by the persons who are in our hospitals. In other words, the impact of this 1.5, in Senator Montague's words, seems to have been former Senator and now Minister of National Security, seems to have been of no avail. So, I raise here the issue of the reduced expenditure, and I hope that this give back is not going to further, it's going to mean that we're spending less on poor people. Mr. President, one area would benefit from is crime fighting, if we could spend more money on it. And so I'm wondering, where is the morality of doing these give back rather than using the potential revenue to aid in the crime against fight against crime, where the murder rates have been escalating. RGR reported this morning, 26% higher than last year. And we in this house not concerned enough about it to put it on the agenda, to have it discussed against giving back. Because that's what these bills are about, giving back, relieving those who may want for their own purpose, own selfish purpose too, to get this relief. And it wouldn't be wasting parliamentary time passing these three bills, Senator Gill. And as you so beautifully put it, with the IMF consent. We're not wasting parliamentary time other than to give back to some people. Otherwise, we would need to have come here today. My concern is about the other people who must give it. Mr. President, since my 30 minutes have been interrupted and it's coming to an end, I just want to raise one other issue, on which, despite the disagreement, Senator Webby, we can find accord. It's a regional stock exchange. I agree with you. There have been efforts to do that over time. Just a couple of weeks ago, Senate Member of Parliament in Barbados came here, Ms. Motley, the leader of the opposition, and she spoke about the Caribbean being stronger together. And she spoke about the stock exchange. So we have common ground on that. But there are some issues, Senator Webby, that need to be addressed. The government's long-standing negative attitude to CARICOM seems to be coming to an end. But they need to proclaim it loud, that they no longer hold unilateral nationalistic views, but they are embracing regionalism. And to this end, Mr. President, I'd like to make a call on the government to release the long outstanding Bruce Golding report on CARICOM that was ordered by the Prime Minister. That was a commission that had been set up. The commission delivered its report. But that report, if it's not in file 13, it has been locked away so tight that the Jamaican people paid for it. Can't see it? So, in furtherance of your call, Senator Webby, for the regional stock exchange, so we can develop, because there's cross-border trading taking place now. But to advance to a regional stock exchange, we must let the Jamaican people see what former Prime Minister Golding wrote in that report. It would appear to me that it will require a fundamental change in the mindset of the present government to accept what previous governments made up of Michael Manley, P.J. Patterson, Portia Simpson, and Dr. Peter Phillips hasn't yet been there, but will be there one day. I've been saying that together we are stronger as a region. And in this respect, Mr. President, if some of the money from the give back went to aid the people of Dominica and other countries in the region, I would applaud it. We are not opposing these bills, but a dialogue must be had. A dialogue must be put on the table about who gets the give back and who pays for it. And I am saying the poor have been paying for too long. It's time to give real benefits, real give back to the poor. Start with moving the education tax for all those below the threshold of income tax. May it please you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Brown. Senator Samuda.
Mr. President, permission to speak from a seat, not my own.
Why are you seeking that?
I like this seat.
Why are you seeking that permission?
I get to use the two microphones. You can actually hear me properly this week.
Okay, fine. Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Mr. President, I know my colleague senator is a man who is well-read and generally means well. So I would hate to think that his intentions were to mislead. But he spoke about give back and treatment of the poor. And I know he's a man who is well-read, so I trust he read the report from Statin that was tabled a few weeks ago, Living Conditions of 2015. And it tells you, Mr. President, of the results of policies that were made while you sat on this side, Mr. President. It tells you, Mr. President, that poverty in 2015 rose to the second highest level ever, Mr. President. No, I'm responding to the comments made by Senator Brown. Oh, no. Important to note, though, Mr. President, in the same way that clearly he has not had a chance yet to read this report, it is doubtful whether he had a chance to read the 3 bills on which he just presented. Because it is clear.
Senator Brown, come give him a chance, man.
Don't worry, Mr. President. No protection needed. Mr. President, it is clear to me.
Point of order, Mr. President. Now, in the same way that Senator Brown was asked to speak to the bill, I think if Senator Brown trade from the bill, then Senator Matthew is even going further outside that scope. So I asked him to please stick to the bill.
You agree that Senator Brown straight from the bill?
You came to that conclusion.
Let me tell you, I'm going to apply the same rules to him as Senator Brown. Go ahead,
So
please.
I asked him to stick to the parameters of the bill, please.
Go ahead, please, Senator Samuda. And
It is clear to me, though, Mr. President, that my well-read colleague did not spend much time to read the bills that were before him. Or clearly, his understanding of it is different than certainly everyone on this side, and I believe even his colleagues. The impact, it is not a give back. There is no doubt that companies would not approach us if we don't make this concession. there's no reason a company would do this kind of buyback if these concessions are not made. So in search of greater economic growth, in search of greater economic activity, this is a natural step which was supported by his colleague senator. So the implications are either an intention to mislead or a misunderstanding on his part. I would rather prefer to believe that it is a misunderstanding on his part, Mr. President. But also he stated, or rather made a call regarding the education tax. I find it curious, Mr. President. I am proud that on this side, this administration took particular steps to remove non-mandatory auxiliary fees. And we chastised, laughed at all kind of things from the opposition. When you look at the value of that contribution to the education of Jamaica's poorest and most vulnerable, and the fact that you have helped schools that were not getting the type of resources required with the increased allocations, Mr. President, I find it a little curious, that being the call from Senator Brown. Because at the end of the day, what we have done for education by way of that policy, Mr. President, is something that every single member on this side is and can be proud of, Mr. President. Senator Brown asked where were the additional taxes coming from and who was paying them. I'll posit one thing, Mr. President. Perhaps it's the additional 35,800 people who have gotten jobs since this administration came into power. Should it please you, Mr. President?
Senator Brown, come now, man. Stop the shouting across the island, man. Senator Knight.
Thank you, President. President, I'm neither...
I'm sorry. Thank you, Senator Samula. Senator
I'm neither... you know, it seems to me that you prefer me in this post more than I prefer to be in it. I'm neither an economist nor a tax expert, but on occasions I've followed some debate, both in this country and the debate going on now in the country to our north, our neighbors, the United States, about tax reform and what is tax cut and whether or not the tax reform is going to bring about a shortfall and so on. And there are always persons on one side and persons on another side. And clearly, in our debate here on these bills, there are persons who form one view as to the impact of the legislation, and there are persons who form another view as to the impact. And it is always a good thing that these views be aired so that in the wider society, the conversation can continue even after the debate in the Parliament has ended. I just want to know this. Let me preface it firstly by something said by every senator on this side, which is that in the overall consideration, we are supportive of the bills. And therefore, when the time comes, that will be shown. But there are questions that are still raised about the impact. So I would be pleased if the leader of government business could educate me and perhaps some other persons in the wider society about the impact. I would ask, from the legislation that we are about to pass, are there any beneficiaries And if there are beneficiaries, can you identify a class of beneficiaries? For example, business people or whomsoever. And what is the nature of the benefit that will be derived? If there are no beneficiaries, what is the need for the legislation? And so, if these questions are answered, then it would put me personally on a firmer footing in going outside of this chamber and being able to say to persons who will greet me on the street and say, Senator Knight, you were in Parliament when these bills were being debated. What impact will it have on me? What impact will it have on the group into which I fall, the poor? And then when I go elsewhere, I will find some others who will say, what impact will it have on me, the middle class? And then another group will ask me, I am in the business class. What impact will it have on me? What am I expected now to do as a businessman to take advantage of this? And I must be able to say to him, there is an advantage. So please tell us, what is the advantage? To whom and how? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Knight. Where is it? Oh, the lady.
It's fine. It's fine. Thank you, Mr. President. Let me start by thanking colleagues for their contribution to the debate on both sides. I pause, Mr. President, because there were several issues which were raised by colleagues which are really entirely outside the scope of the legislation before us, and even before the scope of, beyond the scope of implications and consequences of the legislation before us. In that the legislation before us, the changes which are being implemented are actually quite narrow. We are aligning amendments made in the Companies Act in 2004 with the tax underpinnings that would facilitate and encourage use of the opportunity created by those 2004 amendments. Elsewhere, similar legislation has been implemented within the Caribbean, within other developed countries, which recognize that increased activity on your stock exchange, increased liquidity in your markets, stimulates broader economic activity and broader economic growth. Strong companies that trade actively, that are able to repurchase their stocks as one of the mechanisms available for them, employ more people, they pay more taxes overall, if not the particular taxes that are being dealt with here, and they generally contribute to economic prosperity. Mr. President, the changes which are being done here are to stimulate activity. They are to create activity which does not exist, because the amendments which were made in 2004 were not activated with the tax benefits that would actually encourage the options to be taken care of. So there is no give back. We're speaking about buybacks, and I can't imagine how one would leap from a buyback to a give back, save that they have the commonality of a word and a hyphen. But they're not the same thing. The buyback, the share buyback which is taking place not in circumstances where revenue replacement actually occurs or is required. Because the revenue activity is not taking place. When Cabinet approved this legislation, it was approved on the basis that there was little to no fiscal implications whatsoever, because there is some room for the presumption that the possibility of activity could take place, in that it is not constrained or prohibited anymore. It is permitted, and therefore it is possible, and therefore you cannot say none. However, the activity has not been taking place, and the intention is to now make it happen, Mr. President. It is an understanding, it requires an understanding of growth, an understanding of expansion and activity and capacity, and how that can in fact spur prosperity. Yeah. Every incentive does not, and today's incentive does not, require revenue replacement. So I am here to give that assurance to those senators who are concerned about that particular matter. Mr. President, the amendments before us will assist in ease of doing business. It will assist in increasing liquidity in the markets, and perhaps increase even the desire to move towards a regional stock exchange. We all know now that there are cross-listings which are permitted and facilitated by legislation, by technology. Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad, if I recall correctly, all cross-list on each other's stock exchange. And a regional stock exchange is a logical progression therefrom. So I'm sure work will continue in that regard, and the call placed by the Senate this morning will undoubtedly raise the visibility of that issue. I want to note and recognize that concerns were raised by Senator Fraser-Binns around the matter of managing the process and recognizing that there are risks that come with the benefits, and acknowledging that, just emphasize points highlighted by Senator Webby, which I know, of course, are within the knowledge of Senator Fraser-Binns as well, who would practice in this area, that the rules of the stock exchange provide safeguards in terms of the notices that have to be given, the provisions that a minority shareholder has in terms of protection if they feel that circumstances are being abused, the fact that the transactions that take place will be transparent, because the company must indicate the purpose for which they are implementing the buyback. They must provide source of funds, and they must indicate that their ability, that they are able to afford it without any prejudice to the company, and therefore no prejudice to the workers of those companies. So there's a safeguard in place, and the issue that we're dealing with today is that nobody's been using all of these provisions because it's too costly. It doesn't make sense. It hasn't made sense as a financial mechanism. So there is no loss to the revenue as a result of these implications. We are simply generating another type of activity that will have other benefits. So we shouldn't conflate the issues. We shouldn't seek to conflate the issues. So, Mr. President, in those circumstances, and I had indicated quite clearly at the beginning that listed companies are the companies that will undertake these transactions, because they are shared transactions, and they are transactions that take place on the stock exchange. So publicly listed companies within which ordinary shareholders and average Jamaicans can hold a piece by purchasing a share on the Jamaica Stock Exchange. Those are the persons who will access and benefit from these transactions, Mr. President. So, Mr. President, I want to just note that the broader observations that were made around the requirement for government agencies such as the NHT and the expenses which they bear in terms of transfer tax, etc., are matters which are now being considered under reviews of the transfer tax, etc. Transfer Tax Act and the Stamp Duty Act. But that is not at a stage where I am able to give any sort of indication as to whether this has been deemed to be feasible or not. And similarly, the matter of education tax, which was raised, does not arise under this bill, nor under the principal Stamp Duty Transfer Tax Acts, etc., which are being amended before us today. But it is a call which has been made, and I'm quite sure that the powers that be have heard it. Mr. President, with that, I think I've dealt with the matters which are relevant to the bills before us, and I ask Mr. President for second reading of the bill.
You're asking for second reading of all the three bills, the companion bills. The question is that the bills entitled an Act to amend the Income Tax Act, an Act to amend the Transfer Tax Act, and an Act to amend the Stamp Duty Act be read for a second time. Those in favor? Against? Madam Clerk.
A bill entitled an Act to amend the Income Tax Act read a second time. A bill entitled an Act to amend the Transfer Tax Act read a second time. A bill entitled an Act to amend the Stamp Duty Act read a second time.
The Senate will now resolve itself into a committee of the whole Senate to consider the bills, clause by clause.
Mr. President, may I just ask, with the agreement of the opposition senators, that we take the clauses within each bill en bloc, given that there are no objections or oppositions to the contents.
Yes, Senator Knight. Senator Morris.
Okay. Two points that I wanted to raise, Mr. Chairman, because
this is in relation to the Income Tax Act, the first one.
Yes.
Okay.
In response to Minister in her closing, I was wondering if there's any commitment or undertaking to the point that I raised about linking these incentives to the social policy agenda, if that would be taken on board in a broader context discussion, because I think that is relevant in terms of driving the social agenda and empowering some of our vulnerable citizens. And at the same time, Mr. President, as it relates to the point that you had raised earlier about the state of the Parliament, I'm certain that the clerk would have advised you that we had done significant work in terms of getting individuals from overseas and locally to make sure that the facility becomes accessible. And I see where there's a commitment in the budget this year to get the hydraulic lift, which was in train some time ago. And so some progress is being made, Mr. President. But the point that you raised, that the facility must become accessible for those who have physical disabilities. We have done some work. Sign language interpretation is taking place here and so forth. But we need to take it to the next level to get that hydraulic lift so that persons with physical disabilities can enter the Parliament.
Thank you very much, Senator Morris. In relation to the Act to amend the Income Tax Act, I have put clauses 1 and 2. Those in favor? Against? The ayes have it. I put the title and enacting clause. Those in favor? Against? The ayes have it. In relation to an Act to amend the Transfer Tax Act, I put clauses 1 to 5. Thank you, Senator Morris. Those in favor? Against? The ayes have it. I put the title and enacting clause. Those in favor? Against? The ayes have it. In relation to an act to amend the Stamp Duty Act, I put clauses 1 and 2. Those in favor? Against? The ayes have it. I put the title and enacting clause. Those in favor? Against? The ayes have it. The question is that I do report the bill as having passed committee stage without the bills. Thank you. I put the bills. The question is that I do report the bills as having passed committee stage without amendments. Those in favor? Against? The ayes have it. I do report the bills as having passed committee stage without amendments.
Mr. President, I beg for third reading of the bill. Bills.
Bills, Leader. Thank you. The question is that the bills be read for a third time. Those in favor? Against? The ayes have it.
A bill entitled An Act to Amend the Income Tax Act, read a third time and passed. A bill entitled An Act to Amend the Transfer Tax Act, read a third time and passed. A bill entitled An Act to Amend the Stamp Duty Act, read a third time and passed.
Mr. President, it is not intended to do any further business today. May I ask that the Senate be adjourned for a date to be fixed?
Before I adjourn, may I wish you all a quiet Heroes Weekend at a time when the nation reflects on the contribution and sacrifice made by our forefathers. I invite you to join in the celebrations on Monday, the 16th, which is a public holiday, Heroes Day. A number of our colleagues are being honored at King's House. Senator Webby and our esteemed Clerk Cook. So if you have the opportunity, please come out and pay our respects, not only to both our senator, both persons here who are receiving award, but the members of the society who are being recognized, and also bear in mind the contemplation of the sacrifice of our heroes. The question is that the Senate be adjourned for a date to be fixed. Those in favor? Against? This Honourable Senate now stands adjourned.
Be an active participant in your child's life. Spend time with your child. No phones, no television, no distractions. Just the two of you. Just the two of us. Get to know your child through play. Why not go to the park and get on the monkey bars? Sharing a meal can also be a time of bonding. If your child's in school, be involved in school activities. Speak with your child's teacher. Follow up on their progress in school and see how you can help. Assist them with homework. Attend parent-teacher meetings and support school fundraising events. Remember, your child's future is in your hands. Safeguard it.
So glad you are a child of mine.
News. affairs, business, sports, culture and the arts. You're watching PBC Jamaica.
It's Friday, October 13. This is the news on PBCJ. I am Simone Absalom. Justice Minister Delroy Chuck has weighed in on the debate surrounding the involvement of community leaders, or Dons, in the redevelopment of downtown Kingston. Some 35 Dons have informed stakeholders in the redevelopment of downtown Kingston that they want a piece of the action to restore the capital city.
This country would be making a serious mistake if it even have further discussion with these Dons as to how you're going to develop a community or a country, unless they go on the straight and narrow path.
The Justice Minister was speaking at a Rotary Club of Kingston meeting. He also noted that communities controlled by criminal elements, which he calls criminogenic communities, must be dealt with. He listed scamming and lack of payment for electricity and water as some of the issues to be resolved in these areas.
And that is why NWC cannot account for over 70% of the water produced, because a lot of it is social water.
Plans are underway to transform College of Agriculture, Science and Education, CASE, institution into a university within the next 5 years. Interim President of CASE, Dr. Derek Deslandes, said in order to achieve that objective, more research-based academic staff will be hired and new methods and technologies introduced, such as clean plant material to improve farmer productivity, establishment of a tunnel-ventilated chicken house, and improvements to the piggery and dairy production. In an address to a Rotary Club meeting, Dr. Deslandes said that a proposal has been made to the National Housing Trust to create more space for offices, classrooms and dormitories to handle the expected increase in student matriculation. Enrollment has increased by 50% over the last 3 years. Minister of Finance and Public Service Audley Shaw is now in Washington, D.C. to attend the annual meetings of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The minister and his delegation are also to attend the annual meeting of finance ministers of the Commonwealth that has on its agenda innovation in technologies in public finance and boosting of economic development and job creation. During the 3-day visit, Minister Shaw and Minister of State Fayval Williams will have a series of bilateral meetings with multilateral agencies and other investors interested in doing business with Jamaica. Mr. Shaw will also address the Small States Forum and attend a Caribbean group breakfast with the IMF Managing Director. On a Saturday, Mr. Shaw will receive an award as the Outstanding Finance Minister for the Caribbean for 2017 from Global Markets publication. Minister of Culture, Gender, Entertainment and Sport, Olivia Grange, says that providing support to victims is critical in the strategy to end gender violence. Speaking at the opening ceremony for the newly renovated and expanded Women's Inc. shelter in Kingston, Minister Grange said the shelters, quote, provide the psychosocial support required to break down the barriers that discourage and prevent women and children from seeking assistance, end quote. The shelter, which is operated by Women's Inc., was renovated through the assistance from the United States Agency for International Development. In regional news, in Dominica, schools are set to reopen on Monday, October 16. Prime Minister Roosevelt Skerrit made the announcement during a daily press brief on Thursday. Schools have been closed since the damaging passage of Hurricane Maria.
The precise or the exact list or precise list of schools will be issued by the Ministry of Education by the end of today, so that students will know which schools they'll be attending. The ministry is suspending all uniform requirements, so you do not need to have your uniforms, because many of us students or children's uniform would have been destroyed or damaged, and there's no way to purchase new uniforms.
The Prime Minister was also set to meet with insurance companies on Thursday for an update on payments and to see how the government can assist the process.
To facilitate the assessments that will be done, and also the payments, because the insurance company and the insurance payouts, the payouts are going to be critical in the rebuilding of the private sector and the reconstruction of our private homes and private businesses, and even for the public sector itself.
United States President Donald Trump says emergency relief efforts in hurricane-ravaged Puerto Rico cannot continue, quote, forever, end quote. In tweets, he accused Puerto Rico of, quote, total lack of accountability, end quote, adding that, quote, electric and all infrastructure was disaster before hurricanes, end quote. The island's 3.4 million residents are U.S. citizens, 90% of whom are without power, some 3 weeks after Hurricane Maria. According to the BBC, on Thursday, Congress approved a $36.5 billion disaster relief bill. And Venezuelans are set to vote on Sunday in regional elections. Sunday's polls are the first contested by the opposition since the legislative elections in 2015, which gave it a majority in parliament. The opposition, unable to sustain the protests in which 125 people were killed between April and July, is seeking a big turnout, which experts say could give them a victory in the vast majority of Venezuela's 23 states in the vote to elect governors. International powers accuse of President Maduro of dismantling democracy by taking over state institutions in wake of an economic collapse. Caribbean Airlines earlier this week announced the appointment of Garvin Madeira as its new Chief Executive Officer with immediate effect. He is a graduate of the University of Oxford, the University of London, and the University of the West Indies. Those were the local and regional news stories. Do stay with us. Sports is next. In sports, the second of the three-day match one-day international series between West Indies women and Sri Lankan women bowls off in a short while in Trinidad. West Indies women defeated Sri Lanka women by 6 wickets to take a 1-0 lead in their three-match one-day international series on Wednesday. Set a target of 137, they quickly racked up their score with 11 overs to spare. The win gave them much needed in the new round of the ICC World Women's Championships. A trial of 4-day test matches have been set to complement plans for a test championship and one-day international league. The International Cricket Council gave the nod to plans for 9 teams to play 6 series of test matches over a 2-year period, 3 at home and 3 away, culminating in a World Test Championship final. A 13-team ODI league introduced from 2021 will now be used to qualify for the World Cup. And in other sporting news, World Athletics chief Sebastian Coe wants a major review of track and field to ensure it survives as a spectator sport. With the sport's biggest star, Usain Bolt, retired, International Association of Athletics President Coe is considering franchised teams bidding for athletes or even pop-up tracks in streets and football stadiums to attract new fans. There are fears that the next World Championships, set for Qatar in 2019, will not draw the usual crowds or worldwide interest. particularly as Bolt hung up his spikes after London. World number 1 Rafael Nadal beat Grigor Dimitrov to register his 15th consecutive win and reach the semi-finals of the Shanghai Masters. The Spaniard won 6-4, 6-7, 4-7, 6-4 in 2 hours and 35 minutes. Nadal, who has never won the title in Shanghai, will face 4th seed Martin Klich in the last 4. And those were the news and sports. Stay with us for the weather report. A trough is moving across Western Caribbean. A high-pressure ridge is expected to build briefly across Jamaica tomorrow before another trough moves into the vicinity of the island on Sunday. This afternoon, expect scattered showers and thunderstorms across sections of most parishes. Tonight is forecast to be partly cloudy with lingering showers. Tomorrow morning should be mainly fair, but there's a forecast of rainfall in the afternoon across most parishes. In the regional forecast, we look to the Eastern Caribbean, where a strong tropical wave east of the Lesser Antilles with a slight chance of developing into a tropical cyclone will affect those countries in the next 5 days. And that's it for the weather report. Thanks so much for making it PBCJ. Remember, we are the People's Station.